welcome to the first event in our Nuclear Crossroads speaker series here. Today we have Keir Lieber and Daryl Press. Both Professors Lieber and Press have published very widely in the U.S. national security policy and nuclear deterrence in leading academic and foreign policy publications like International Security, Security Studies, Foreign Affairs, Atlantic Monthly. Keir Lieber is Associate Professor at the Walsh School of Foreign Service and the Department of Government at Georgetown University. And Daryl Press, Professor Press, is an Associate Professor in the Department of Government at Dartmouth College, and he received his PhD from MIT. Dr. Lieber received his PhD from the University of Chicago. I suspect that I don't have to encourage you all to be interactive here, but please don't be shy. You know how technical people are. So let me introduce first Tristan Volpe, who is the father of the Nuclear Crossroads series. And Tristan, why don't you come up and tell us what we're going to do today?
Thank you, Bruce. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Professors Lieber and Press to Lawrence Livermore on behalf of the Nuclear Crossroads series, which for the next year is going to bring in a series of experts to assess issues at the intersection of strategic deterrence and nuclear proliferation. So to kick off this series, I could think of no two better experts than Lieber and Press, who are two of the leading academic scholars on strategic nuclear policy today. Over the last decade, Keir and Daryl have co-authored a series of widely read and disseminated articles on the role of nuclear weapons in international politics. They are currently working on a book manuscript that tries to bring together this large body of work to advance two key points. First, that technological innovation has dramatically improved the ability of states to launch counterforce attacks. And second, the focus of this morning's seminar is going to be on their second key argument, and that is that deterring the use of nuclear weapons within conventional conflicts is going to be much more difficult today and in the future than it has been in the past. They're going to conclude this presentation with a series of policy implications for U.S. national security policy, conventional and nuclear force structure, as well as the nuclear weapons complex. I will moderate a general question and answer session after their presentation, and we'll try and wrap up around 11:30 a.m., but given the interest in this subject, we can go 5 or 10 minutes over. And with that, the stage is yours.
But let me get your blood boiling right off the bat by talking about what we would describe as the Washington consensus, the view in Washington about nuclear weapons in general. And I'm sorry to tell you, as if you don't already know, the general consensus is that nuclear weapons are relics of a bygone era in many ways, right? Very specifically, for the U.S. and our allies, nuclear weapons are kind of unnecessary, using nuclear weapons in particular, because of our conventional superiority, right? In the past, we loved nuclear weapons. We needed them, which I'll say more about in a second. But today, we don't need them, which is one of the reasons why we can go around the world saying that others don't need them. But for us, they're unnecessary. For our potential adversaries, nuclear weapons use is just irrational, given U.S. nuclear and conventional, for that matter, retaliatory capabilities. You know, the common saying in Washington is, who would be crazy enough to use nuclear weapons against Uncle Sam? We've got thousands of nuclear weapons. Less than thousands, depending on how you're counting these days. So given that basic view, the nuclear dangers out there lie elsewhere, not in traditional interstate nuclear deterrence arena, but it get people thinking about irrational leaders. Is Kim Jong-un, irrational? Would an Iranian, nuclear-armed Iran be so fanatical as to use them? Terrorists, of course, nuclear security issues, and accidents even. Those are the dangers that take priority in debates and discussions in Washington these days. And that has some important implications. The first, of course, is that deterrence issues, interstate deterrence issues, are being ignored. The problem of escalation that we'll talk about today, escalation in the midst of a conventional war, is really not appreciated, not understood flat out, in many cases not appreciated enough in others. Because of that, nuclear modernization is often seen as a luxury that we just can't afford in these times. And U.S. nuclear policy, at least, boils down to non-proliferation, arms control, nuclear security. Again, not interstate nuclear deterrence issues. Our argument is that this is dangerously mistaken, the conventional wisdom in Washington and elsewhere, and that the greatest international security danger of the 21st century will be deterring U.S. and other adversaries from escalating to the nuclear level, for adopting coercive nuclear escalation in the midst of a conventional conflict. And what we want to emphasize here is the rationality of this strategy, which is often not appreciated. This is not crazy, delusional leaders resorting to nukes because they're crazy. This is a rational strategy, and we want to walk through that logic. And this is important to do now, not in the midst of a conflict on the Korean Peninsula, which is going to unfold very quickly, not in the midst of air-sea battle against China or any other conflict. For the United States in particular, it's important to understand these dynamics now. We need to think about what kinds of capabilities we would want to deter, and if deterrence fails, to mitigate that kind of escalatory strategy. And in the end, we are going to stress that the United States and other planners need to think hard about how to trade off military effectiveness against the escalation risks. If we're facing these major escalation risks in these wars, how do we fight them in a way that might not initiate nuclear escalation right off the bat? So let me first talk about the nature of the problem. I'll go through a few slides and then hand things over to Daryl for the second half of the talk. The nature of the problem begins with the fact that the United States has extensive alliance commitments around the world, right? And it's also the case that our closest allies face either nuclear-armed adversaries or potential nuclear-armed adversaries. We also have the fact that the United States fights a lot of wars, right? When the Cold War ended and there was a lot of talk about the peace on earth that would break out, the last decade and a half have undermined, a couple decades have undermined that. God, we're getting old, aren't we? We fought 6 major combat operations since 1990 alone. Uncle Sam fights wars quite often. And because of this, because of our extensive alliance commitments, and because of our track record, it's reasonable to assume or to predict that a military clash against a nuclear-armed adversary is a distinct possibility. The most common flashpoint that people point to is the Korean Peninsula against nuclear-armed North Korea. Perhaps this also involves China and the disputes over in East Asia. And in the future, Pakistan, Iran, Russia increasingly. I just returned from a trip to Europe where many more people are concerned about the Russian nuclear arsenal than they are about any potential Iranian one. The next step in analyzing the problem is to understand that the United States and our allies enjoy massive conventional military superiority. Okay? We strongly prefer to keep our wars conventional. We would prefer to fight our wars at the conventional level because we will win our wars at the conventional level. And we can get into debates about how long U.S. conventional superiority is going to last. But when you look out at the world today and you think about any conflict dyad, any potential U.S. adversary, the United States is going to win and win quickly in terms of traditional military operations at the conventional level. But our adversaries know this as well. And our adversaries have to find a way to forestall defeat. And nuclear weapons, often said the weapons of the weak, they're a powerful stalemating tool. And this is not some abstract logic about the stalemating capability of nuclear weapons. The logic should be familiar to anyone who was alive during the Cold War, who has studied the Cold War. This was U.S. NATO policy in the Cold War. The strategy of coercive nuclear escalation that we're talking about was U.S. policy. Right? If the Soviet Union had invaded Western Europe, come pouring across the North German plain or through the Fulda Gap in West Germany, the the United States and its allies were going to use nuclear weapons, right? This was the only plan on the shelf. We built the forces, we trained the forces, we distributed nuclear weapons all over Western Europe. And our objective, especially in the not in the immediate beginning of the Cold War, but as we went further along, was not to nuke Moscow right off the bat, but to use nuclear weapons in a coercive way, right? To build those weapons, to use them in a coercive way to deter the invasion in the first place, and if the invasion happened, to coerce a halt to that conflict before we escalated to general all-out nuclear war. The point we want to emphasize is that the dynamics are the same today. The only thing that's changed are the places at the table. Now, the United States and its allies are the conventionally strong power, and it's our adversaries who face conventional inferiority. And for that reason, the reason we reached for nukes should apply the same to our adversaries today. Now, this still seems a little crazy. Why would an adversary reach for nuclear weapons in this context? Why would adversaries risk nuclear escalation? There are actually three different pathways to this danger. The first is that if we do what we've done in Iraq in 2003 and before, if we pursue regime change, the adversary faces a life and death incentive to coerce a halt to the conflict. Okay, there's the ace in the hole, the only alternative they have than to lose power. If we decide instead to take regime change off the table, we appreciate that. We're not going to go to Pyongyang. We're not going to go to another Baghdad. We're going to pursue more limited aims. The regime may still fall. A quick example would be on the Korean Peninsula. If we decide that if a war breaks out, we and our South Korean allies, the Combined Forces Command, we're not going to go all the way to Pyongyang. We don't want to threaten the regime. We're afraid they might use nuclear weapons. Instead, what we'll do is crush Kim's military. Maybe we'll go 25 kilometers north of the DMZ to take out the artillery threat, and we'll stop there. The problem there is that that outcome may not be, in Kim's mind, a regime surviving outcome. That may spell the end of his regime, and we simply may not understand that, in which case coercive nuclear escalation is an alternative. And third, even if we adopt limited aims that truly would not be threatening to the regime, the way that we fight our wars is inherently escalatory. The way of modern wars, not just the United States, but any sophisticated military, is going to fight in a similar fashion. Again, we've seen this movie before several times. In the first days of every war that we fought since the end of the Cold War, we see a similar kind of set of operations. From day one, we're attempting blinding and disabling attacks against command and control. Our objective is to deny situational awareness to the adversary. We go after radar sites, we go after air defenses, we go after leadership targets. It makes a lot of sense. Why do we do that? Because it's a great way to fight war in the 21st century. The downside of that is that an adversary who lacks situational awareness may come to the conclusion that life is over for the regime. And you're back to number one, which is their perception that we're pursuing regime change, in which case nuclear weapons are the one tool that they can use to check mighty Uncle Sam. Losing a war to the United States, just in case we forget what happens when you lose a war and you think regime change is not so bad, it is a terrible outcome. If we could interview Noriega rotting in prison, he would probably agree. Milosevic is dead. Karadzic's rotting in prison in The Hague. Saddam is dead. Gaddafi's dead. Saddam's brothers are dead. Gaddafi's family's dead. This is the outcome that our adversaries face when you lose a conventional war to the United States. Right? Our regional, what we call limited wars, regional wars, are their total wars. And we shouldn't forget that. And the implications, when the United States loses a regional war, right, this is not the outcome. This is the outcome for the other guy. Let me walk through a scenario. It shows we chose the Korean Peninsula to lay out the logic, to illustrate the logic of coercive nuclear escalation. The point is not to predict how the war starts. We were just over in Seoul speaking to U.S. and allied folks about this, and I think we were concerned that we would get on a tangent about what actions are exactly going to bring about this conventional conflict. That's not what we want to do here. The goal of the scenario is just to help us understand what considerations might cause an adversary to escalate to the nuclear level, and then, most importantly, where does that leave us? Where does that leave the United States? What options would we have once an adversary has crossed the nuclear threshold? So, assume a crisis with North Korea tomorrow, in a couple years, but assume there's a crisis, assume it leads to conflict. Maybe it begins with North Korean shelling of the South. The Combined Forces Command, the U.S. and South Korean forces, launch counter-battery operations. Maybe another South Korean ship is attacked. And again, when you hear South Koreans say, if this happens again, we're going to war. Operations intensify, and North Korean forces cross the border. If that happens, of course, the U.S. and South Korean forces are going to be launching all kinds of air operations, seed attacks, suppression of enemy air defenses, attacks on enemy C4I, follow-on forces, and assume that this goes well. The Combined Forces Command is able to halt the North Korean advance and quickly shift over to a counteroffensive, which is likely what would occur and occur very quickly if this unfolds. If North Korea continues to fight, Pyongyang faces a severe dilemma. If they continue to fight, they face inevitable defeat. The North Korean regime is not going to fight and win a conventional war against the U.S. and its South Korean allies. And in that case, the Kim regime is going to face the same fate of Saddam faced and Gaddafi faced. And again, don't take my word for it. They used this example. After Libya fell and Gaddafi was pulled from a culvert, severely beaten, murdered, etc., the North Korean official media put out an announcement and said, what more reason do you need to see that, that why a state needs nuclear weapons? There are two options. First of all, maybe there's some kind of golden parachute on the table. Maybe some kind of arrangement where the North Korean regime could flee to a dacha somewhere in China. It's Kim and his top 60 picks, whoever he wants, could survive. But let's assume for now that that option is not available. The only other alternative that we see is escalation to the nuclear level to force stalemate. So what does this actually look like? This is not a North Korean nuclear strike against Los Angeles, even if North Korea had that capability. This is something lower on the spectrum. The spectrum could be anything from a North Korean detonation on its own territory, a test detonation, to a detonation over the Sea of Japan, or a detonation over a U.S. carrier group, or hitting a Japanese city, or hitting a South Korean city. Here we chose a missile strike against Kadena Air Force Base in Japan with a 20-kiloton nuclear weapon. And most importantly, it's the threat of what's to come. The North Korean regime says, halt the conventional war now, or we will use another dozen weapons on Japanese and South Korean cities. If you continue that march to Pyongyang, that's what we're going to do. If that happens, what does the president, he or she, face in this case, right, in the United States or our allies? The enemy has crossed the nuclear threshold and is threatening to nuke a bunch more additional targets, including cities of our allies. We have essentially four options. Maybe you can come up with some more, but I think most options fall into these categories. The first option is to say, you know what, this has gone way too far. Right? We didn't mind fighting a conventional war. We didn't want a nuclear war. And what we're going to do is accept a ceasefire. Basically cave into the demands. We've got lawyers and spin doctors, and we can spin it any way we want. But we'll accept a ceasefire. Let's halt this war before it goes any further. The downside, of course, what you see on the right side here in this column, is that sets a really troubling precedent. A troubling precedent for those that are most concerned about non-proliferation. The message that you've sent is that anybody who wants to check the United States just needs to use a nuclear weapon, and the job gets done. So potential adversaries in the future will see the wisdom of acquiring nuclear weapons. And it's even worse than that. Our friends, our allies now have reason to question the U.S. nuclear umbrella, and will see the utility of having nuclear weapons of their own. Second option, which sometimes we hear when we present this analysis, is, wait, North Korea went nuclear? Okay, we're turning Pyongyang into glass. Right? We are going after the North Korean leadership. We're going to talk about setting a precedent. We're going to set a precedent that anybody who uses nuclear weapons is going to suffer, I don't know, is there even a worse fate than death? We're going to go after the North Korean leadership. This is not about killing Korean people, but we're going after the leadership. The downside of this, and march on Pyongyang, we'll continue the march on Pyongyang. We'll wait till, the radiation levels, are reduced. But eventually, we're going to own the peninsula. Maybe we'll rely on missile defense. If we're nuking Pyongyang, we might expect them to use nuclear weapons against our allies. Hopefully, missile defense will help alleviate that problem. The problem with this strategy, of course, is that those leadership targets are located in major population centers. So we're going to be killing millions of Korean people. And secondly, it may not do anything to address the risk of future nuclear strikes. If Kim has delegated authority, if commanders have permission to use nuclear weapons, they follow through on those orders, we risk several more hits on Allied territory. A third option, which we sometimes hear this, probably the least option I venture to say we've heard less than the others, is that you just ignore the escalation. You continue the march on Pyongyang. You rely on missile defense. Maybe this is the arms control community. Our friends in the arms control community sometimes say, look, this is a great example to not resort to nuclear weapons. The adversary did it. Doesn't mean that we have to do it. And if we can fight and win this war, then we will have set a terrific precedent that nuclear use doesn't solve things, doesn't pull your chestnuts out of the fire. The big downside of this, of course, you're doing nothing to address the danger of additional nuclear hits on Allied territory. And because of that, you are risking permanent damage to the global alliance network.
Not to mention your own forces.
Not to mention your own forces, of course. The fourth option, which may help deal with the additional threat, of course, is a counter-force strike, going after the North Korean nuclear delivery systems, warheads, weapons, whatever we know, wherever we can find them. Yeah, we're still going to rely on missile defense. We're still continuing the march on Pyongyang. But we have to go after the threat, and the threat is embodied in those weapons. The downside here, of course, we may not destroy them all, and the problem with counter-force is that if you don't destroy the other guy's nuclear arsenal completely, the odds of that arsenal being used against you, are quite high. I mean, they may have already been high anyways, but you certainly, if you're hoping for restraint, that's probably out the window at that point. And equally important, if it's a nuclear strike, using nuclear weapons against nuclear weapons, then we risk killing, again, millions of non-combatants. So this is not a pretty picture. We used to call this slide, I think, 4 grim options, and I think very much that's where we stand. Let me hand things off to Daryl to talk about the additional implications.
Okay, thanks. Well, I always feel so depressed listening to the first half of this briefing. It makes me imagine how you guys feel. As Keir said, we gave this briefing to a handful of audiences in South Korea recently, and after one of these, a fairly senior South Korean said, that does in fact seem grim, that does put your country and mine in a very difficult situation, but there's one mistake that you made. And we said, please tell us. And he backed us up a few slides and he said, that is not the Sea of Japan, that is the East Sea. So I noticed we haven't changed that yet. I think we're just going to take all the markings, off of the names of maybe every country off of there just to avoid distracting. As Keir said, all these options are lousy in different ways, but that shouldn't be surprising, which is that's why nuclear weapons, that's why escalation is a useful strategy. That's fundamentally why we think of and have thought of for decades as nuclear weapons as a very useful stalemating weapon for the weak. As Keir said, when NATO expected that it would have difficulty defending itself conventionally in the context of a big war in Europe, in the Cold War, that's why nuclear weapons were valuable to NATO, because the Soviets, in that case, didn't have a good response option. Just like none of these 4 options here is a very good response option for the United States and South Korea. I'm sure we can kill lots of people in Pyongyang, number 2, but that risks lots of nuclear attacks. It doesn't solve the problem. The vulnerability of South Korean and Japanese cities to nuclear response. We could kill lots of millions of people. That doesn't solve the problem. They can still do it. Number 4 is maybe the logic, in some ways, a logical response, but you might not get them all. You likely will not get them all. So all these options stink. But that's why nuclear weapons are useful stalemating devices. When we look at this, though, there are 3 remaining questions, which is number 1 is, well, that sounds worrying, but we could make PowerPoint slides, the folks in this room especially, on 20 different worrying things, having nothing to do with this that we could all, could ruin your day. Asteroid strikes, smallpox getting out of labs, you name it. We can make PowerPoint slides of scary things. The question is, just because there are scary things that are tough to solve doesn't mean it should be a focus of national attention, and especially if it has big budgetary consequences. So the question is this really how real leaders in the real world actually think, or is this just kind of a scary set of PowerPoint slides? Number one. Number two is perhaps it's a difficult dilemma, but maybe our nuclear arsenal is moving in the right direction given these threats. I was expecting in this audience there might be chuckles on that number two, but we'll see in a second. And then number three is, well, maybe we're thinking about this question pretty carefully at the level of conventional war planning. Because again, what Keir was talking about was about the linkages between U.S. conventional operations or U.S. allied conventional operations and adversary incentives to escalate. So maybe we have a pretty good handle on this problem from the standpoint of conventional operations and planning. So let's go through these one at a time. So first of all, do countries actually think of this way? Again, if you might do this, but if you talk to people in Washington about nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, the thing we keep telling ourselves over and over again, the thing that people in Washington is these are weapons of the past. Nobody with their right mind is going to use these weapons. These are weapons that don't serve modern purposes. And the amazing thing is you actually don't need this presentation that we made you sit through. If you just listen to what others are saying on the other side, they say you're wrong. Which is actually, if you look at the declaratory nuclear policies of other countries, including the folks, well, it's specifically countries who have nuclear weapons and yet face military inferiority, conventional inferiority over conflicts that they are deeply concerned about, the vast majority of them are telling you they are planning exactly this. You don't have to take our word for this. So the Pakistanis say openly, this is one of the principal purposes of our nuclear arsenal, us Pakistan. They say we intend to use nuclear weapons as a way of stalemating Indian conventional forces if they invade Pakistan. We don't have to read tea leaves. You don't even have to speak, local languages. Russia today specifically justifies and explains their nuclear arsenal by talking about neighbors of Russia who have superior conventional forces and the utility of aspects of the Russian nuclear arsenal for countering conventional defeat. And this is what they're saying, and we're like, nobody would use these. These don't serve modern conventional problems. North Korea doesn't speak as often, but there was a document, we haven't got our hands on it. It was, again, a striking document produced, I guess, about a year ago in North Korea that basically talked about the employment of North Korean nuclear weapons in a variety, in an escalatory fashion for the purpose of stalemating CFC, conventional forces and conventional operations. Israel, I don't think there's very much about Israeli nuclear doctrine, but again, I'd bet my car, if not my house. Actually, I might even bet my house on this one, that one of the key attributes of kind of Israeli concepts of the utilization of nuclear weapons has to do with, among other scenarios, a scenario where they suffer an unexpected major conventional defeat to one of their neighbor states as a way of coercing a quick end to the conflict. So again, the Washington conversation is these are weapons to solve a problem that no longer exists, not 21st century weapons. But everybody else is saying, no, you're wrong. We intend to use these to pull our chestnuts out of the fire. And so there's a real disjuncture in the talk about this. The one question mark in here is China, which is, again, a country who is in a situation where it could lose badly conventional wars, and yet doesn't openly talk about these weapons this way. Hypothesis one is China's just different in their thinking. That happens. Hypothesis two is they're not being completely open with the way they think about these things. I don't know which is correct. Okay. So it's a bad problem. That's unfortunate. I mean, it's good for people, I guess, working for the weapons labs, but it's bad for the rest of us. But maybe we've got this kind of handled. Maybe the arsenal's already moving in the right direction. And so you'd say, well, what is the right direction? So obviously, there are lots of different nuclear missions. Even in the United States, where the role of nuclear weapons in the U.S. national security strategy is diminishing, there's still multiple uses of nuclear weapons in terms of, deterring strategic attack on the United States of America or other attacks of mass effect on the United States of America. But what are the kinds of attributes in the force that would be useful if you were facing these sorts of circumstances? And typically when we talk through people, and in some different environments, we kind of bring people into the conversation, we could do it later, and talk through how much you dislike different options on this. And it usually becomes a conversation about which of these options is least bad. And often people end up kind of getting rid of numbers 2 and 3, because at the end of the day, if you're not doing anything to protect Japanese and Korean cities, it's a pretty terrible option. And so they go back and forth between finding some way to make number 1 politically acceptable. Is there some sort of way of getting yourself out of this thing? or number 4, finding some way of defending yourself from subsequent attacks through number 4. And oftentimes, their attractiveness of going to 1 depends on how attractive they think the capabilities are for 4. If you think you can do a pretty good counterforce operation, then maybe that's the right option. If you can't, then maybe it means you have to find some acceptable way to go to do number 1 or something like that. So the question is, what are the attributes in the force that would give you a better versus worse counterforce capability? And at least when you're thinking about the nuclear component of this, I think 3 attributes of weapon systems seem to kind of jump right out. One is promptness. So if, to the extent you're trying to destroy North Korean delivery systems or weapons and storage bunkers before they're used, obviously the length of time between when you locate a specific target and when a weapon arrives on that target is really important. And maybe you want to get a lot less than 30 minutes. Number 2 is accuracy. And number 3 is yield. Now, some people who are less knowledgeable about these topics than this audience say, well, why does it matter what the yield is? A nuke is a nuke. The consequences are giant, et cetera. You shouldn't be worried about yield. Again, here the chuckles. People here, I think many of you guys know, that's not the case. There are vast differences in terms of consequences. So one illustration of kind of the differences is we did a little modeling using HPAC, which is a Department of Energy and Department of Defense piece of software that tracks fallout plumes. And we asked, we obviously it's all open source, and so we don't know where hardened targets are that might be nuclear storage sites or particularly interesting bunkers that might be associated with the right mobile launchers in North Korea. So we just picked 5 locations. You can see them better on the right side because it's kind of obscured by the fallout plumes on the left. But we picked 5 locations just around the compass signs of North Korea and said, imagine a counterforce strike was aimed at a handful of sites which the United States at that time believed were associated with North Korean nuclear delivery systems. What are the consequences of attacking those sites either with kind of a run-of-the-mill U.S. nuclear strike using high-yield weapons, which might be a 2-on-1 attack against 5 targets using the highest, again, according to open sources, the highest yield ballistic missile weapon in the U.S. arsenal, so the W-88 off a Trident II weapon. What's the consequence of doing it that way versus with the lowest yield existing weapon in the U.S. force? So this is not a new weapon. So this was modeled on a low-yield version of a B-83, which could be delivered, let's say, by a B-2 or by a tactical aircraft in the region. The answer is a nuke does not equal a nuke, which is, and these were both picked with altitudes appropriate to destroy hardened targets. But the problem was it's difficult to employ high-yield weapons low enough to do a lot of damage to hardened targets, but high enough to avoid fallout. And so if you do it with a high-yield weapon, you cause substantial fallout in the region. We presented this in different audiences react to that left half differently. We presented this to some allied audiences who were rather, before they thought the problem was how do you get convinced that the United States will actually be credible and use nuclear weapons? Maybe that suggests the second problem is, dear God, what if the United States does? We presented this to a PACOM audience where the response of one of the planners was, damn, that fallout plume totally shuts down my air war plan. And our response was, at least it occurred to us, that might not be the biggest consequence of that left strike. But again, you're talking about millions of fatalities. Whereas, again, if you have target location intelligence, low-yield weapons give you a very different effect. So our point is yield, if you're thinking about what attributes in the force might make it better from a counterforce standpoint, yield matters. If you're going to have low yield, then so the accuracy becomes a real primary thing. So then you ask yourself, is the arsenal moving in the right direction? And typically what you hear about the U.S. arsenal is we have plenty of capabilities. The question is, which ones do we need to retain as we shrink the force? Actually, we'd argue is we don't actually have the right capabilities even today for these kinds of scenarios, which is, do we have things that are prompt? Yes. Do we have things that are low yield? Yes. Do we have things that are accurate? Yes. Do we have things that marry those 3 characteristics? It doesn't appear so, at least in the open source. Now, whether there have been things that have been done to shape or massage, I can't remember the word, of ballistic missile warheads, I don't know. Don't tell me if you do. But at least in the open source, it doesn't seem like we have things that marry all 3 of those things. Okay, so the arsenal might be going the wrong direction in some respects. And some of the things that would be most useful might be on the chopping block. Last thing is maybe conventional planners have this, or maybe this has been well kind of understood at the level of conventional planners. And that's what Keir and I have been focusing on for the last I guess, year or so, talking to conventional war planners in Hawaii, in South Korea, elsewhere. And I think the view is changing in a positive direction among U.S. conventional war planners. But even 18 months ago when we started talking to them about this, the principal reaction was basically, this isn't our problem. We're conventional war planners. The folks we talked to, with, again, I think a growing exception among the China conventional planners and PACOM, who I think about this increasingly. But in general, conventional war planners say, we fight the conventional fight. That's our job. That's a difficult enough job to worry about nuclear escalation. We interviewed folks who, again, had their hands dirty with various operations plans, and we said, to what extent does target selection in the plans you work on, is it done with the purpose of avoiding escalation? And they kind of laughed. They said, avoid escalation? We don't know how you do that. Where do you put a 500-pound bomb for the purpose of escalation control? And they'd say, well, I pick targets with 2 goals, kill red, protect blue, et cetera. We talked about, well, are targets taken off the list for the purpose of escalation control? They said no. They talked about targets being taken off target lists for other reasons. Cultural sensitivity reasons, yes. Try to avoid the Chinese embassy, yes. Try to avoid things which you don't want to attack for political reasons. But in terms of escalation control causing withholds, it's very limited. Again, it's a function of the stovepipe nature of the U.S. military. There are nuclear war planners, there are conventional planners, and that's still a big problem. Beyond these things, in the Korean context and elsewhere, allies get a vote too. And even though I think the U.S. forces Korea sees this now as not because of Keir and me, because they understand this, they see this as a growing problem. The South Koreans view things very, very differently. And they basically view the next Korean War as the last Korean War, et cetera. Okay, what can planners do going forward? I'll show just a couple more slides and we'll stop. So from the conventional war plan standpoint, there's no simple answer. All options are, I'd say, problematic. But you might want to think about, or conventional planners might want to think about this as having two kind of, extreme is the wrong words, two kind of options for the conventional war at different ends of the spectrum. So one is, and here we use the Korean context, I think it's the easiest to talk about in this. So one is, you fight your conventional wars. We don't want a conventional war on the Korean Peninsula. But if it happens, how do you fight the conventional war on the Korean Peninsula? To win. This is one view, that the way you minimize civilian consequences, allied consequences, U.S. consequences is by winning the conventional war as decisively and quickly as possible. And so what that basically says is the end state should be regime elimination, because probably that regime's going to fall anyway if there's another big conventional war, so we should aim at that as quickly and rapidly as possible. That therefore ground operations should be aimed in CFC plans to quickly repel the attack and rapidly transition over to a counteroffensive. What should be the targets of U.S. and South Korean air and missile attacks? The answer is everything. L meaning leadership. Leadership from day one, from hour one, preferably from hour -5. Leadership, command and control, NBC, nuclear, biological, chemical, destroy the North Korean integrated air defense system. Yeah, sure, we'll do some combat air support for the local fight and battlefield air interdiction. Diplomacy, as rapidly as this thing starts, the aim of U.S. messaging and diplomacy has to be to try to get this golden parachute on the table that Keir talked about. Try to convince the North Korean regime, try to convince the Chinese to offer them a golden parachute to Kim and as wide a network as possible. And the message for the North Korean regime should be, your regime is over. But you senior and mid-level North Koreans who might be in positions to either implement or not nuclear plans, you have a choice to make. And your decisions now will have a big effect, a big decision on whether you survive or not individually and whether your family survives. So this is kind of the extreme version. Extreme is the wrong way. It's the one side of the continuum for the most decisive. Most restrained, which is to say end state will not be to seek the end of the North Korean regime, that perhaps the end state should be to get a little bit north at the end of the war to control the artillery sites that threaten Seoul, and then avoid escalation, because we don't want it going down this route. Ground operations, quickly repel the attacks, go maybe 20, 25 kilometers north and stop. What about air and missile strikes? The answer is you can't do a lot of those things on the left. And this is the key thing, which is if the entire strategy for avoiding escalation is by convincing the North Korean regime that they're not going to end up like Saddam and Gaddafi, if the strategy in this right column is to convince them that they have a future if they don't escalate, then you presumably can't be attacking leadership sites. You presumably don't want to be attacking nuclear sites. Because if that's their trump card that's keeping us back, and the first 6 hours of the air war, we're launching 200 F-16 strikes at those targets, they don't have to be geniuses to know once we eliminate them, we can go to Pyongyang. So you probably have to have a highly restrained air and missile campaign. You probably still want to get the Chinese to prepare a golden parachute. And then here the messaging is the opposite, is you're trying to message a regime that says, you do have a future if you restrain yourself. But if you don't, then we're going to Pyongyang. All right. The obvious fact here is there are trade-offs here. There are trade-offs between effectiveness and escalation risks. The left strategy is going to be way more effective than the right, but the left one basically forces them down the path that Keir describes. It forces them to use nuclear weapons. And we should just be real clear that column on the right, it might not work from an escalation control standpoint, which is, first of all, the South Koreans might have their own war plan. They might be going north. Second of all, is the North Korean government, more than us, might know. Somebody was talking about the Malcolm Gladwell, what the dog saw, was that the name of it? From the North Korean standpoint, even if we're being highly restrained, they might know that if we don't stop immediately, 25 kilometers is too far, they're going to fall. And so this might not succeed in preventing escalation, but there's a trade-off here. But in a way, the most important message, I think, from the standpoint of a conventional war planner is the following, is blundering into a conventional strategy that is a mixture of the two might be the absolute worst of all options, and it might be where we are today. Namely, if a president in the Oval Office is briefed that he has a conventional option that he and the leaders of South Korea have agreed upon for waging this conventional war, and if that's what the president authorizes, I want a limited conventional option, only 20 kilometers north, escalation control is my goal. And he or she, the president, signs off on that. But they don't know that that limited option still involves, within the first 4 to 6 hours, 250 F-16 strikes against the North Korean leadership and their MBC targets, then we might be leaning into or even forcing adversary nuclear escalation when the goal was to stop, was to prevent it, and creating kind of strategic political incoherence. You might say, well, that sounds scary, but that's never going to happen. This is, in a way, what we did in 1991. So in 1991 with Saddam, the entirety of our strategy was a limited offensive to push Iraq out of Kuwait. And we explicitly told them, James Baker told Tariq Aziz, we are not going for regime change, and we expect you not to use your chem or bioweapons. That was the war when they actually had them. So we have to kind of think back. But there was an explicit deal to make that. We said, we're not going to Baghdad, but you better not use chem or bioweapons. So we had a coherent limited war strategy. What was the air campaign aimed at? Counter leadership, counter WMD. So the point is, and again, we don't have access to the CFC war plans at the unclassified level, but I just say this, folks who we know well have told us, if the White House wants to restrain attacks on leadership and NBC in a Korean scenario, they better get that information to us really quickly in the first hours of a conflict, because otherwise it might be tough to put that genie back in the bottle. All right, last slide, conclusion. All right, so what does all this mean? So first of all, and this is the most important thing. The most important thing, nothing else matters in this one, which is the conventional wisdom in Washington is nuclear weapons are a relic. Intentional nuclear use isn't going to happen. There are no rational reasons to use nuclear weapons, let alone against the United States, for God's sake. We have the most powerful nuclear weapons on the planet, most powerful nuclear forces. But this is wrong, which is adversaries do have major incentives to escalate for the same reason we intended to do it when we were going to get overrun in this war in Western Europe. And so rather than be shocked, what were they thinking? How did this happen? I guess the North Koreans were crazy. We would serve ourselves and our allies well to understand what their incentives are now and how we might be making those more or less likely. Number two is the intermediate or the immediate political and military challenges is, number one, is to make sure that conventional war planners are focused on this danger, to try to get civilian leadership in Washington to understand better what these dynamics might be, and also to make sure that as we cut the arsenal, that again, rather than being a numbers game, what's the right number, 880, 762, 550, that really should be a capabilities discussion. What are the capabilities remaining in the US arsenal and in the complementary conventional forces that would be most useful to us in this scenario, both from the standpoint of deterring escalation by the adversary and protecting protecting allies and ourselves if it happens. And finally, there's the big challenge for the analytic community, and this is where I feel totally sheepish, and Keir does too as well. We had, a very well-meaning major out in U.S. PACOM said, so what do you guys know? What does your field produce? You've studied nuclear deterrence for 60 years, 70 years, not us, but our field. So what kind of targets would we want to hit to prevent escalation? The answer is we don't have good analytic concepts about how you wage conventional war without causing escalation. With the reason being in the Cold War, that wasn't our task. NATO's task was to escalate. It's only now that we're trying to fight conventional war without escalation. And finally is try to communicate these deterrence challenges to the public so they don't think about the nuclear arsenal and nuclear modernization and nuclear forces merely as holdovers from a different era, but they understand the key role that it still places in US and allied national security problems. So with that, let's end and just take as many questions as you guys have.
Thank you. That was quite thought-provoking. So there's no roving mic, so you need to speak up. Questions? In the front.
Let me go to scenario number 4 that you laid out. And I want to tease it out a little more. Rather than worry about escalation control, I want to design a conventional counterforce campaign that preemptively destroys the nukes. This is more applicable to the Pakistan, North Korea, maybe Iran scenario than the Russian scenario, obviously. When I go through your capabilities, there was always one no in those boxes, but the air-delivered options relied on promptness. You said it's not prompt. I'm not sure that it has to be prompt, but you need tactical surprise, which you could get with air-delivered weapons. So my question is, why couldn't a conventional war planner rely on tactical surprise, conventional counterforce to destroy preemptively those nuclear weapons, and then you have missile defense in 3 of those options to mop up, or air defense and missile defense, to mop up the so-called ragged retaliatory strike? Why isn't that a perfectly reasonable, coherent, and possibly doable conventional strategy?
Yeah. Do you want to?
Remember, we also have the, I'm probably going to back up the conventional comparison site. Why don't you take it?
So the question of kind of why is promptness so important? I guess let me think about it 2 ways. So when we're talking about promptness, we're talking about time from, and can you hear me, by the way? Can people in the back hear me? Yes. We're talking about time from target identification to arrival of weapon system. So I think you're right that in a situation in which either one of 2 situations, so a pre-war situation in which we're initiating the conventional or nuclear disarming strike for the purpose, because we see where this is going, then it reduces the importance of promptness because we're acting first. The time. So I think that's right. You could do it from Missouri, from Whiteman Air Force Base, if there's no ticking clock because you're going first. I think the promptness gets more important if you're in a conflict situation where the adversary has employed them, and especially let me kind of real time.
Nuclear weapons?
Say it again.
Where the adversaries employed
nuclear the adversaries employed nuclear weapons. Although let me kind of say it differently. I'm sorry. Whether we've gone first or the adversary has gone first in terms of employing nuclear weapons, I think still the key thing is the length of time between sensor and munition. And to some extent, you can massage that if you can keep giving sensor updates to either the bomber crew in the air or even with different weapons to the munition in the air, then the long flight time from Missouri might not matter so much.
Well, the shortest link from sensor to weapon application would be if the aircraft has its own sensor platform.
Sure, that's
You
right.
can't get faster than that.
Yeah.
And so if you're doing search and destroy
Yeah.
or the old mobile target hunting missions, that I'm not saying they necessarily work today, but conceptually at least, that could be an effective option.
Yeah, let me just put a slide back up here. Not quite sure if maybe I'm not quite getting your question in a sense. So with this, we're not at all making the case against the existing bomb or DCA's dual capable aircraft. And in fact, kind of one of the, where Keir and I started working on, I'm going to sit down next to Keir. when we started working on force structure, one of the big arguments we were making is we were saying this is a strong, strong argument for the modernization of the B-61, for the reported improved accuracy of the B-61. And the B-61, especially on aircraft which were deployed toward the theater, could probably be the best you could do toward many of these objectives we've just talked about. But our understanding is there are all kinds of constraints in terms of employing this. So again, without going into classified, we can't go too far on this, but my understanding is unless you have storage vaults on the Korean Peninsula for the dual capable aircraft, you might be highly reluctant to move one might be highly reluctant to move nuclear weapons on F-16s to the Korean Peninsula if there's a conflict. Even from Guam, you have to take the distance and divide by 520 miles an hour or something like this. But it's multiple hours from decision to employ them until they arrive if you're going for dual capable aircraft. But we didn't mean to imply that the dual capable aircraft don't have a role to play. Far from it. If you look at the current arsenal and just open source discussions about yield options, the only thing in the US arsenal which has the accuracy and the yield to do this sort of thing is the current air delivered weapons. But am I missing?
Let me
I want to stay out of the nuclear business.
Yeah.
I want to use B-61. I want to use F-35 out of South Korea with some forward-looking infrared, and because in the North Korean scenario, if you think KN-08s and no-dongs and things like that, they're mobile missiles where it's target location is the key, not yield or anything like that. If you can find it, you can destroy it with conventional warheads. You don't need a nuke. If you can't find it, you probably need your W-88 to start doing some area barrages. So the key is finding it. Once you find it, you can destroy it quickly. And the best platform I could think of is F-35 with that sensor on it, maybe B-2 with some radar or something like that on it, and you do scud hunting. But this time, you'd want it to be effective. That's the big question.
Yeah, just a couple of points of clarification. I mean, number one, if it's an issue about, we focused on the implications for the nuclear force structure, and part of what I take from your question is, well, if we know this is a problem, why don't we conventionally preempt, and then some of these issues, about promptness aren't as much of a concern because you're operating from strategic surprise, et cetera. First of all, we are not opposed to conventional counterforce. I mean, in fact, we're, it'd be harder to find two people who would support that as well. So this is not an issue of nuclear versus conventional in terms of where we should be thinking about counterforce. The second point I make is that there's no doubt that people are thinking about this, that there are analysts who look at this scenario, maybe for the reasons we say, see no way out of North Korean nuclear escalation if war comes. If you know that, then on hour minute one, you want to go after everything with everything you've got. Now, obviously, you'd like to do that without nuclears if you can, and we could add cyber to this, and we could add all sorts of other things. So people are, kind of thinking about this. The last thing I'll say is that, number one, there might be obvious political reasons not to preempt. Okay, again, maybe you're going into this conflict expecting to keep it limited somehow, and by preempting with a conventional attack on your adversary's nuclear forces, that's fairly escalatory. And the second thing is, and this might lead to a bigger discussion, which I'm not sure we want to get into, right now, right here, although maybe willing if you push it. There are some things that conventional maybe can't do when it comes to going after nuclear forces, and so you may need nuclear no matter how you look at it. There may be some things cyber can't do, and then conventional as well.
Just 1 second. I apologize, Dean. I totally misunderstood your question. I'm tired. But you were asking the conventional question. Just to give one little hint on what Keir just said is the quick answer people give often is why can't you do all this with conventional if you can find the targets? And kind of one way of thinking about this is the ability to do this with conventional forces probably depends on a lot of things related to the context and how the conflict has unfolded. So if you've already suppressed their air defenses, if you've already suppressed GPS jamming, which is going to be key for very accurate delivery of the conventional weapons. If you already have big force packages in the theater, because you're going to be doing simultaneous conventional strikes that are going to have to be escorted in to multiple targets in different locations. And I don't mean to say that you can't do those. So in the midst of a big ongoing conventional war, where you've already done the seed campaign and suppressed GPS jammers, you might be in a good position to do such things with conventionally. Earlier in the campaign, where you might not have enough air in the theater to do that, where seed hasn't been suppressed, where GPS jamming has not been suppressed, your conventional capabilities will be much, much smaller relative to the nuclear. But in terms of kind of the details of that, we could talk through. Sorry, I missed your question.
Who's next?
take that. I mean, a little bit further. For one thing, it's not just a question of preemption because, I mean, you listed conventional counterforces. I mean, you listed that in your number 4 option. So I was kind of expecting to see it included in this table. Yeah. So if you look, longer term and add that, would you argue that in terms of capabilities, we are moving in the right direction in terms of conventional counterforce? Do you see that as a viable path? This is not preemptive, but as a response to a limited nuclear strike by a limited power like North Korea.
Yeah, I think of the short term. Or not the short term. I think that the short answer is to say, in our judgment, the United States is doing about 6 things. Actually, we're giving another talk to a different audience here this afternoon, and we have a list of 6 or 7 things the United States is doing to sharpen its counterforce capabilities. And the one that we're doing, yeah, that's right. Only the least one is some things relating to nuclear forces. It's kind of traditional conventional strike, prompt global conventional strike. It's missile defense. It's ISR upgrades to kind of integrate better sensors and shooters. It's ASW. It's some other stuff. And we think that this is a approach which is very useful to this. At the end of the day, we see these as complementary capabilities with nuclear. And I guess there's a couple different reasons. And one of them has to do with all these contextual things, which is conventional, because your lethal radius of a conventional 2,000-pound bomb against a hardened shelter, your lethal radius is so much smaller than even against a B-61 at 0.3 kilotons. Where a B-61 at 0.3 kilotons, depending on how you do the math, you might have 10, 20 meters of lethal radius. With the GPS guided bomb, you might have to basically hit the target. And so given that, you have much less, you need many more weapons on target. You're much more sensitive to GPS jamming and these sorts of things. So we still think there's a nuclear role on this. With respect to the target finding TELs, or mobile launchers, our read of the Scud hunt in 1991 that Dean referred to was that the big problem with the Scud hunt in 91 was not locating a mobile launcher. It was the growing target location uncertainty that grows exponentially with time since last observation. And it was that growing target location uncertainty between sensor and shooter. And if you're using a cluster munition or something like that, you just have a much smaller lethal radius than if you're using a low-yield nuclear weapon against a soft target. And so you still do, we did some modeling we could show you, or you've done it maybe yourself, about what is the differential value of using low-yield nuclear against even mobile targets rather than area conventional. There still is a gap between those two.
Do you have a real-world example of any regime that's ever accepted a golden parachute?
Idi Amin. Well, he went to Saudi, didn't he?
Yeah.
Idi Amin?
It seems the most viable option, but it just seems relatively impossible to get them to do it.
And there's no question this is not a very viable and appealing option. I mean, we can't, whether or not, the extent to which we're speaking with the Chinese about this possibility for North Korea before a conflict, I mean, I hope so, but I wouldn't bet Daryl's car on it.
So given where you've gone with this in your discussions with USFK and USFJ and with PACOM, I understand you also had discussions with the allies. So what are their feelings? Because they have to have confidence in the U.S. deterrent at the end of the day. And so did you talk about this with them in terms of capabilities, and what is their belief in the power of the U.S. deterrent to be able to protect them?
It's a great question. I'm hesitant to respond in one sense, which is that it seems like you can find any ally that you want. Like I have my Japanese friends who tell me they were nervous about the retirement of the TLAM-N, okay? But James Acton or Perkovich or these armed controller folks said they have their Japanese allied friends who say that's ridiculous. We don't, our faith in the U.S. alliance doesn't depend on the actual nuclear capabilities. So I mean they're wrong. I'm right. But the point is this. Again, we both Japanese and well, actually in Europe too, but Japanese and South Koreans analysts have seen this, both policymakers and not. And Again, I'm ambivalent. I'm not sure how to respond because on the one hand, there is nervousness, okay, about, first of all, they're just coming to the terms with the idea that this could escalate to the nuclear level. I think in some ways, particularly South Korean allies, think that American nuclear capabilities just take off the table an adversary nuclear escalation. They think, often our allies think we can do a lot more than we actually can do, so they have this great faith in it, and yet they, again, grossly generalizing, tend not to understand that their actions are going to help precipitate reactions that we may not be able to deal with. So if anybody seems to be less restrained, I would say it's some of our, again, I have South Korean friends who want to go to Pyongyang at the next war, maybe don't understand these escalation dynamics. But on the other hand, everyone's a realist in these stages these days, and I think people are quite concerned.
We do have a mic now.
So a couple of things that were surprising. One is that in terms of conventional war fighting, that if a nuke is used or goes nuclear, that you're still going to be fighting this conventional war versus Pyongyang. That people would think that it's not their problem. I mean, this is one of the problems we see with war games is it goes nuclear and the game's over. Well, in all these scenarios now, most of the time, it wasn't over. You're still prosecuting conventional war. The other issue with the scenario is a leadership survival scenario possible after we've had a nuke on Kadena? So how many U.S. service members are died? Is that really, or if you hit a South Korean city, okay, is that really a rational possibility in terms of what our leadership may be able to pull off?
You mean to do, in response to that, do anything short of turn Pyongyang into glass kind of an issue?
Or number 4. Leadership change.
Yeah, or launch number 4. I don't know if you have any response. I'll just quickly respond, which is, first of all, okay, let's do a different scenario where they detonate one over the of the EC. The point is there is an escalation ladder, and if you tell me that's going too far, that would trigger a response where no other options are possible, then we might just back it up and say, okay, well, what about this escalatory step? And reasonable people can disagree about where the red line is. It's difficult. It's difficult to say in advance, where exactly the red line is. And some people, say it's lights out if they've used any nuclear device in any kind of way. After nuclear use, why not their problem? Are you referring to the comments from the conventional war planners saying, well, that's mainly like to demonstrate the stovepiping of how we think about, the conventional side and the nuclear side. And their point is, look, did you say the word nuclear? Well, why aren't you talking to Stratcom?
But they're still going to be asked to maintain.
They're still, well, that's what they care about. They care about, maybe what it will be like to operate in a nuclear environment. But again, the kind of reflection that we're looking for, and it would be wrong to say that it's not there at all, but is how did our actions, which were, carrying out the civilians, directive to win the conflict, how did those actions precipitate actions that we didn't want to happen? And there's where we're not seeing a whole lot of a deep appreciation. Again, our instincts are to blame the civilians, even before the military commanders. When we go to Washington and we brief in the Pentagon and we have, DASD level folks saying, don't worry guys, we got this. We have options. And if a conflict on the Korean Peninsula breaks out, we've got categories. We can't speak openly about what we have in mind here, but we have options. And then you go out and you talk to military commanders or other military folks in the Pentagon who kind of look at you cockeyed and say, well, okay, you better tell us in the first hours what exactly you want us to withhold for this purpose. And you got to wonder, there's still, massive kind of disconnect between who's responsible for what here. So, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know if that's a full response.
Yeah, just to build on that in two different ways. So maybe I was not clear when I said this the first time. When we heard or when we hear the "this is not our problem" response from conventional war planners, what they're saying is as they often see it. Again, I think with China scenarios, air-sea battle scenarios in China being a little different. But in general, the attitude is we fight the conventional fight. The president has somebody else for deterrence, for nuclear deterrence. And certainly for nuclear employment if it gets to that. And so they say, we're non-nuclear command. You got on the wrong plane. You shouldn't be out here. And the whole point of what we're trying to say, and again, we did not take part in, we witnessed a pretty nasty shouting fight in one of these meetings between folks from the Joint Staff and folks from the Regional Command, who basically said, right, we have somebody else who deals with nuclear employment if it comes to that, but it is your job, Regional Command, to conduct conventional operations in a way to minimize the odds of escalation. And in fact, that's in the, the guidance on the employment of forces. And so the not my job comment was often about we fight to win the conventional fight, nukes is something else. And what we're trying to say and others are trying to say is, yes, but the way you do your job will affect whether it goes this bad way. On the question you raised about response options, I guess I'd just come back to this slide. I mean, I don't see any way out of this, which is there is the reaction that basically says that, God, if somebody does this, if somebody uses a nuclear weapon against Kadena, there is no way we can do anything other than, we can't possibly leave that regime in power. It's over. That discussion, anyone who makes that argument is going to be out of the Oval Office. But I do think that will be an initial angry, emotional response. But unless somebody in the room has a good story on number 4, conventional only, conventional and nuclear, unless you tell me how the employment of U.S. military forces after that actually saves that dozen Japanese or South Korean cities, then we're going to have to find some politically acceptable way to do number 1. And maybe that politically acceptable way is you attack you nuke some small North Korean city just to have retaliated, and then you have some UN official say, the Secretary General plead for peace and whatever. But that's just a version of number 1. You accept the ceasefire. But you'd hate to do number 1. You'd hate to leave the regime in power. It would be every instinct not to do that. But that hinges on you being able to protect yourself, presumably, and your forces, as somebody said in the back.
So one thing about your scenario is you haven't really discussed China. I'd like to hear more about China, because the last time we had military operations going into North Korea, China was a big player. And it's entirely possible, for example, that as soon as things really got hot, China would step in and say, this really is part of our sphere of influence, and we would be forced to go to number 1.
Yeah, so you're saying we might have to choose number 1 for a different reason, for kind of having to do with kind of risks of broader nuclear escalation with China.
I'd like to
Yep.
maybe develop this scenario
Yeah.
more with some other big regional players in the region besides just one player, us, and then a little player.
Yeah, there's no question that the lack of the third-party dimension to this, other than a kind of casual reference to a possible golden parachute, is not sufficient. It's sufficient for kind of laying out the dynamics of the escalation problem, but I guess since we're tenured professors, we can venture to say things before we've really thought about them without suffering consequences. The only thing I'll just quickly respond to is the idea that China could step in and say, no, you're going to choose option number 1 because of our threats. What are the threats that they would actually make to compel us to do number 1? Are they going to make nuclear threats? I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that at that moment China's going to have a lot of leverage over our actions after we've been nuked. Kadena, our boys have died, or they're at sea and they've died, and China's not going to dictate to us what we're going to do. I mean, you talk about politics for a president. This is this is regime change, self-inflicted regime change. So I kind of see, put yourself in China's shoes. Not clear what kind of leverage they would have. I actually thought you were going to ask a question about what if we did a scenario, over the Taiwan Straits and fighting an amphibious invasion of Taiwan by China and the escalatory dynamics there. In which case, Daryl was going to take the question.
I think another key answer, and I think this is actually super important, is we've got to keep in mind what is the purpose of the scenario in this. Please don't take from this that we're trying to explain to you what would happen in a Korean war on the Korean Peninsula. I know enough about war, Keir knows enough about war to know that we can't predict that. We can't, you can't, nobody can. That's not the purpose of the scenario. The purpose of the scenario is to make what is actually, again, in the current climate of thinking about nuclear weapons, I think a rather bold and unusual claim, which is to say our prosecution of conventional war, either because of the end states we seek or the manner with which we fight, or the fragility of the enemy, creates logical and rational incentives to escalate. If you want to understand how do we think a North Korean war would play out, I think the best we could do is get a bunch of the best North Korea experts, if there are any in the U.S., meaning just because they're so hard to understand, in the U.S. government, and war game it out 50 or 100 times and see the variations, et cetera, and bring China in. And I think I'd be with you. You'd want China to be an active player in this. But that's not our objective here. And so our objective is to say that those of us who are thinking about deterrence and those of us who are thinking about U.S. force structure requirements, conventional and nuclear, need to have the strategic empathy of the adversary situation. And we need to understand that our way of fighting and the end states we seek force even reasonable adversaries to reach for the nuclear trigger. And we might actually be facing people who are not always reasonable. That's the limited purpose of the scenario, and that's why I think it's okay we left out China. We're not trying to predict what would happen in this.
I tend to agree with you that if there's any lack in what we have prepared for, that it originates in the civilian sector. And you started off by saying that in Washington, D.C., characterizing it as broadly not recognizing that there's a legitimate interest by countries that aren't as strong to, in fact, develop something along the lines that we ourselves did, as you say, in the early Cold War, that the Indians specifically stated in the 70s that more recently, when challenged to reduce the stockpile, the Russian president basically stated, and others, is there any way of challenging this inherited knowledge that you talk about in Washington, other than wait for funerals?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm tempted to give a good news, again, because we're such bearers of bad news. The inherited wisdom, as you're right, those of us with, gray hair and graying hair who cut our teeth on nuclear deterrence kind of find, and at the end of the Cold War, just find it so hard to come back to traditional issues of interstate deterrence. But the good news is that there is a younger generation of students. Again, we have a lot of contact with students, and we teach them about nuclear weapons, and they're not starting with those so-called truths of the nuclear age and all these other ideas that nuclear weapons are relevant. They buy. We don't have to convince them, especially if I give this presentation, that nuclear weapons are a problem. And so there's hope, that for future generations. The problem, of course, is that policymakers are making decisions today on Capitol Hill and in Washington. Well, yeah, this is again. I feel odd speaking to you all about this issue about is nuclear modernization. When I hear arms control folks saying, bashing the Obama administration and saying, look, they're proceeding fully with modernization and, they've broken all their commitments and then, on one hand and on the other hand, anybody who kind of knows anything about where we are in terms of nuclear modernization has, good reason to worry and all the rest. It's hard to, as Daryl said, read the tea leaves and say where things are headed or that certain people need to move off the scene. I think to the extent to which we begin to talk about nuclear weapons as if they really do matter, right, the better. And the reality is we may say that nuclear weapons don't matter. I mean, we don't say it here, but public rhetoric is that nuclear weapons don't matter. If you want them, you're evil. Let's get rid of them, global disarmament, et cetera. The reality is even if we believed that stuff, our adversaries, as Daryl said, think differently. And if they think differently, if they care about nukes, then we need to care about nukes. Like nukes, you may not care about nukes, but they care about you. If our adversaries care about nukes, then they're our business. And particularly when it comes to thinking about nuclear counterforce and the realities of the modern era of counterforce, which is kind of a topic for another time, then we need to get serious quickly. But it may not be as desperate as hoping individuals pass from the scene with bad ideas.
Let me kind of add to that one second, which is here we should just all point the fingers at ourselves. I mean seriously, in a positive sense, which is the problem that we're talking about now about kind of misperception and misunderstanding among the public, among Congress who funds these things. Ultimately, that's for us to fix by talking openly and candidly. And the problem is, as you guys know, the number of people who have understanding of these issues is smaller, and the percentage of those people who are working on a day-to-day with TS or higher material is going up. And so the folks who understand these things increasingly can't talk about them publicly. But at the end of the day is in the 1980s, there was a vigorous, detailed debate in the United States about the wisdom and lack of wisdom of various aspects of nuclear modernization. Was the peacekeeper a deterrence, a force for deterrence, or was it a creating instability and et cetera? And we had a public national debate where people took sides about what a good deterrent looks like, force, and how to do this. Nowadays, when our leadership, and I don't just mean the elected leadership, I mean military leadership, think tank leadership, maybe labs leadership, though I haven't been following, when we talk publicly about the roles and missions of the nuclear force, we now publicly talk about it in very general terms. We talk about the signaling power of weapons, we talk about the importance of deterrence, but you don't have a public debate that's anywhere as detailed as when people were talking about the counterforce capabilities of the MX versus the instability consequences of the peacekeeper, excuse me. And so I guess what I'm saying is, and Keir and I are saying, is without going into classified and without arguing against national policy, which is currently it's a reduction of the role of nuclear weapons and working toward a world of zero. Within that construct, you can talk about how various capabilities in the arsenal either further or don't further U.S. national objectives. And it might be politically uncomfortable for people in leadership positions to talk about that because it's become verboten. But we can do it without going into classified, and ultimately, if some of you, if all of you, if most of you agree that this is an important mission, it ultimately falls upon us to talk publicly about why, in terms of actual capabilities, why certain conventional capabilities are really important for the conventional counterforce role, why counterforce is important for the alliance network, why these capabilities would be really valuable and useful for protecting us and our forces and our allies if war came to us. But ultimately, we just have to be willing to talk openly and honestly about national policy. And I think you can. I think our national policy is defensible about we don't want to use nuclear weapons, but we might be forced to. So let's talk about what that means.
Wait for the microphone.
So sort of as an opposite pole in terms of a representative example, have you developed a Russia scenario?
Keir talked about the Russians. No.
No,
No, we have not.
it's been years.
Because I would argue that, as an explicit policy, they have nuclear de-escalation. There's great uncertainty about what kind of target sets would actually be targeted with the right weapons, what their perceptions of a response would be. So I would argue that you're dealing with a different situation because the classic Cold War end state still exists there. The North Koreans, at least, until they develop ICBMs, can't threaten their national survival. And something happens with the Russians and it goes wrong. You're in really deep hurt, you're back to the worst case. And yet they've adopted a policy, sort of like folded gap, without the automatic, it's going to lead to political escalation. I really think that, scenarios and responses like that, if somebody needs to be thinking about this in a way that can be discussed in the open.
Just very quick, I'll say that we used to say, when we give our list of, what countries think this way and what's the evidence, it's easy to point to Pakistan. This is official nuclear doctrine is coercive nuclear escalation. For Russia, we used to say, at least rhetorically, they would argue their need to retain tactical nuclear capabilities was necessary, vis-a-vis NATO conventional power. And so obviously we're not going to make an arms control agreement to cut tactical nuclear weapons. We need this. And then after saying that a few times, I was going to say Soviet experts, Russian experts now, tell us, no, you don't need to say it rhetorically. I mean, that is actually the way they're thinking about nuclear use and nuclear weapons. So it's even a better, example of it than we've suggested. And I think maybe I'll take the opportunity to make one broader point, which is that, this danger of coercive nuclear escalation applies. It's not just a U.S. problem. I mean, the U.S. that's on our mind, and because we have these extensive alliance commitments and because our conventional power is so strong, it's important for us to understand this problem. But for India and Pakistan, that dyad of countries faces similar dynamics. It's just a different world from the Cold War, where the nuclear powers were armed to the teeth, and it might have been difficult to think about it in the same way. These dynamics apply in many different places, potentially.
And I'm sure you studied the nuclear posture review, and so the question I have is, how do you see it as addressing or not addressing your issues, and where would you want to see it either modified or emphasized in the public debate?
So I think, do you want me to start with this?
Yeah, please.
So let me start with the general. I think the public debate, the public discussion, at the broadest level, should be modified in the following way, which is we can say the truthful statements. I think they're truthful. That the United States wishes, as a national policy, wishes that nuclear weapons never be used again. Number one. And number two is that we are working to reduce their role in U.S. national security strategy. We should say those things. I think they're truthful. Then we should say that it is still the United States policy to have the threat of nuclear use and the actuality, if necessary, as a way of deterring nuclear strikes on the United States and its allies and responding if necessary. We can get that far. Then we should say the third set, which is we should say, to that end, we, the United States, should be asking ourselves what sorts of capabilities in the conventional and nuclear arsenal would actually be most useful to us and our allies if we had to use them, with the notion that those are the exact capabilities that would be most useful for the purpose of deterring employment by the adversary and for reducing the consequences to us and our allies if we got to there. It's that third part which is utterly and completely missing from our public discussion of nuclear weapons. And again, it doesn't contradict national policy. It just reflects kind of a squeamishness to actually say deterrence is bolstered if you have actual capabilities, whether they're conventional or nuclear, to respond if deterrence fails. And furthermore, secondarily, you're better off if you have better capabilities once deterrence fails. And then linking modernization debates. So if there's a public debate about whether we should spend the money to modernize the B-61, we should be talking about what are the circumstances, whether it's in Russia and Estonia and Latvia, or what are the circumstances in which that could plausibly be useful to have that weapon versus a different weapon. And when people are talking about what exactly should go into the requirements for the follow-on to Trident II, and whether it's important to have a flexible yield option, and whether it's important to spend the money to try to have the CEP again, that people should be willing to talk about, well, are there circumstances under which it would be important to have those capabilities? So I think that's how we try to fix the debate, which is just saying, yeah, we don't want nuclear war, we don't want nuclear weapons to be used, but the deterrent threat that we have, that we continue to have, rests upon certain capabilities. Let's keep our eye on the prize. In terms of the NPR really quickly, I'd just say that the parts of the NPR that I think make sense are the parts that have to do with increasing non-nuclear capabilities for all these missions. I think that makes sense. I also just think that we need now, after a 2-3 decade holiday on work on substantial modernization of U.S. nuclear delivery systems, we just have to, the place I'd add to the NPR is kind of more emphasis on ensuring that we have the right nuclear forces as well for these missions to complement the conventional.
Without a prohibition on new nuclear capabilities that we somehow, an insidious prohibition on these, it's nonsense. I don't know where it came from, and we need to reverse that no matter what.
Seems to be a thought that if we don't develop it, no one else will.
Right.
So we have time for a few more questions, and we get the first one.
In your talking with the American military, particularly those with nuclear authority, did you run into any Curtis LeMays, people who might take your option 4 and say, you bet we're going to strike heavy, fast, and that'll be the end of it? Are there no Curtis LeMays talking in the Oval Office or on Capitol Hill?
Which Curtis LeMay, the George Wallace one, your running mate, or the earlier the man who basically helped us win World War II? I get your.
I'll give you a Curtis LeMay quote just so there's no difficulty understanding. When he was pushing for yet even more bombers, when we had overwhelming destruction of the Soviet Union, they asked the general, why do you want more bombers, more bombs? And he said, quote, I want to see the cinders bounce. Now, do you run into that kind of mentality at all?
I think my answer is going to be the same as Daryl's. I'm going to let him respond more seriously, but some making jokes. I think my answer is no. We don't run into many of those folks at all. But my favorite Curtis LeMay line was when he's being briefed with the president and other cabinet officers on the capabilities of the new ICBM missiles, and he asked about warhead yield, and they tell him the warhead yield. He says, Well, as soon as you can put something bigger than an effing firecracker on the tip of that thing, call me.
Yeah, I guess two very quick answers. So number one, it's my experience, I think Keir's as well, that anytime you talk to somebody wearing uniform, anytime I've talked to it, whether we're talking about pilots of B-52s or whether we're talking about people with command responsibility, everybody talks about them in a very appropriately cautious, reverential, restrained sort of fashion. As befitting basically a national policy, in which we view these as the weapons of last employment choice. And so I've not run into anybody who's talked kind of lightly about the use of nuclear weapons. But here's the important part of my answer. The important part of my answer is because of our Cold War baggage, mine, I'm alleging yours, most of ours, in which by the early 1980s, large-scale nuclear war was going to be an utter and complete catastrophe in one flavor or another for all of us. That we tend to associate the counterforce position, the capabilities or the employment, as being kind of craziness in some fashion. And let me just kind of bring us back to where we were 10 minutes ago, which is if adversary escalation to avoid the fate of Saddam, doesn't want to be hung, doesn't want to have his sons killed, if that's not crazy in the course of a war, then 10 minutes ago, kind of the sentiment I was getting from some of you guys, and I think it's very reasonable, was as you get adversary employment, of course we're not going to do number one. You couldn't remain president of the United States. So that means you're saying the only rational position is going to be some form of number four. Now, I think that's overstated because I think 4 could be lousy enough as an option in some circumstances that you'll end up with a version of number 1. But I just want to kind of be real clear, at least in my view, that the argument that says for the carrying out of the commitments we've made to our allies and the protection of them and the protection to U.S. forward forces and soon the American homeland, saying that you need counterforce capabilities, number 4, to me it's pretty far away from kind of like the crazier part of Curtis LeMay. That in a way, that ought to be the mainstream view of any of you who think a president would have a hard time doing number 1. Otherwise, we're just lying to the Japanese and South Koreans.
Last question. I guess my question is more so back to the China relationship with North Korea and North Korea, the whole relationship there. What if it's even possible, I don't know if it is, if we start a conventional war with North Korea and we do start pushing forward, no nuclear weapon is fired, but China comes over and just like the Korean War pushes us back to almost off the peninsula itself. What then? Do we just stop and use number 1? Probably, I guess, or do we? I guess how likely is that situation?
I don't have a good response to that. I mean, just, we can play out all these different scenarios. It gets away from the logic that we're looking at, which is about logic of nuclear escalation. I mean, again, my quick reaction is that seems highly implausible that China is going to push us off the Korean Peninsula in a conventional war. Again, I could imagine them moving into, forces into the north and us deciding not to continue marching on Pyongyang, which is number 1. Or bringing the war to a halt as quickly as possible via Chinese actions that we kind of agree to. But it's not our area of expertise. It's not something that I would venture a prediction of.
Yeah, I would only add to say, is my understanding, someone correct me if I'm wrong, that the most current NPR, again, maybe didn't take it off in a black letter sort of way, but stepped back considerably from the U.S. employment of nuclear weapons to compensate for conventional military defeat. I think there was a substantial stepping back from that when there was text about kind of the circumstances and the roles for the U.S. nuclear arsenal. I think that was eliminated. Now, there's some blanket language that basically says, but we'll use them to advance the vital national interests whenever. But I think we've taken steps back from kind of envisioning the United States government, from envisioning the employment of U.S. nuclear weapons as a way of dealing with conventional defeat. But again, when bad things are happening and U.S. forces are losing, then a president could always decide what he wants to decide. But to kind of take a step back again, when we talked at people, staff members of the House, we talk to staff members of the Senate, when their bosses are thinking about bills to fund modernization of the nuclear arsenal, the level of kind of engagement is on the level of, well, who's going to nuke the United States? Maybe they like it because of their district, maybe they don't. Maybe they're strong on defense or they don't view themselves as such. But they're not thinking about kind of actual employment of nuclear weapons because nobody's talking to them about that. And if there's one thing that I think as a message that it's important to kind of get out there over and over and over and over and over again, I guess it's two, both from Keir's half of the presentation. Number one, our regional wars are their total wars. And we seem to have think that the big change with the end of the Cold War is it moved from total war to regional war. No, that's from our perspective, not from the dog's perspective. Our regional wars are their total wars. And number two is people tend to believe that, well, there's no rational incentive to use nuclear weapons. And the answer is, when we were going to lose, that was our plan. So maybe adversaries are kinder than us. Maybe they're more risk averse than us. Maybe they care more about humanitarianism than us. But when we face the situation that they face today, not just the United States, but the United States and West Germany and France and Belgium and the UK, they all decided that they were going to employ nuclear weapons rather than be overrun by the Russians. And so if our plans are based on the assumption that adversaries won't think that, we better ask ourselves what's the basis of that assumption.
Great. Thank you all for your time. This has been a most interesting discussion.